Hello, and welcome to Nomadic Diaries, the re-entry series. I'm Doreen Cumberford, the host.
And I'm Linda Mueller, the co-host.
Craig, could you please tell us what was the impetus that you had that really pulled this book through you, the beautiful book, the original book called The Art of Coming Home?
Well, as you might know, I had written my first book in the interculture field, The Art of Crossing Cultures, which describes the front end of this experience, and that was accepted by the press. And I thought, well, there's the other side of this. I looked for a book, there wasn't one. In fact, when I sent my manuscript to, at the time it was called Intercultural Press, they were quite shocked to get a book on repatriation from Craig Storti, who they didn't know except as the author of The Art of Crossing Cultures. And I had a significant experience when I came back from being a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco. And I thought, well, there's lessons to be learned here. Yeah. And I don't see anybody helping anybody through this. So I did a lot of interviews, a lot of research, way back to the beginning with Clyde Austin's book. And just put it all together. And you didn't ask me this, but I get letters or emails these days from time to time from people who've read my books. I get the most heartfelt ones from people who've read The Art of Coming Home, because it just resonated with them and nobody had helped them and they thought there was something wrong with them.
Yes.
And when did you write that original book?
So it first came out in 1996. So that's what? Almost 30 years ago now. That was the original edition. It was reprinted in 2000 something, in 2001, the same book. And then this rewrite was 2022.
You know, I've been working on my version of this for like 7 or 8 years, and I've gotten very stymied by the fact that I couldn't find like backup documentation or science about it. Are you aware of any statistics or data that people can go look at?
Well, one thing I realized needed to be done was all of the sources that I had cited, the statistics I'd cited at the beginning of the original book were 25 years old. And so nobody was going to care much about those. So through searching online, I found a number of surveys. One is, you asked specifically, was done by KPMG in 2020. Another one, Brookfield Global Relocation. That's 2016. Then there's, let's see, what else did I find? A Global Mobility Trend Survey by those global mobility people. Oh, that's the Brookfield one. There may be some others that I'm not seeing just as I look through this, but one of the things I wanted to make sure I did was to update the data, because a new version that has the old data doesn't do you much good and isn't so credible.
Yeah, that's true. And, you know, I've been working on my work for a long time, and I'm not sure that I'm quoting accurate data, but the data I have, and I'd love to know what you think of this data. And I'm sure that our listening audience are very curious, and we will share these resources that you just shared in the show notes for this episode. I have Price Waterhouse, and I don't know what year this was, that 44% of executives quit in the first 2 years after their repatriation. 60% of them have reported they don't feel a sense of belonging. 75% have a demotion or a sense of demotion in their status and in their role. And 66% don't feel like their skills are fully used because they've come back with all these invisible soft skills and new talents, and they don't feel like they're recognized. Do you think that those statistics are anywhere close to accurate?
Well, they sound a little exaggerated, though. Yeah, they sound a little exaggerated. I'm just looking on in my intro where I have some statistics. I see that attrition rates, for example, among people who don't go overseas and who do come back, are actually about the same for all employees. And let's see, in the survey that was done in 2017, it doesn't address your issues, but 80% of Japanese, 71% of the Finns, 64% of the Dutch, and 60% of American managers found repatriation more difficult than going overseas. 52% in 2020, KPMG said that 52% of the organizations it surveyed were planning to increase the number of expats in their organization. So whatever issues there are out there, there may be more. 28% have a repatriation program, but not a workshop. So I don't have that data. You said it was a Price Waterhouse. I know they used to do an annual sort of one, but you don't know what the date of that was.
I'm guessing that the data, this is between 2015 and 2020, somewhere
Okay.
in that period, really prior to COVID. So,
Yeah, okay.
what do you find to be the most surprising or unexpected challenge that you find people face when they return home?
Well, a not very good answer is they're surprised that there should be a challenge.
Yes.
It's home after all.
Right.
And why would you need to adjust to home? What you need to adjust to is something that's unfamiliar.
Yeah.
And of course, that is home when you come back from overseas, whereas where you lived overseas was your home to the extent that you could make it that while you were there. So that challenge, that there's a number of sub issues, of course, but I think one of the biggest surprises people have is that there should be an adjustment, and hence it leads to either two conclusions. Well, maybe they're the same one. That they're doing something wrong, that they don't know something that everybody else knows, and or the problem is them. They shouldn't be having this. And that, of course, leads to not talking about it with people, being embarrassed about it,
Yes.
feeling inadequate.
Yes.
That's a very good answer to your question, Doreen. But that's the biggest the biggest challenge is that there should be a challenge.
Yes. Yeah.
And was that the biggest surprise for you? You mentioned repatriating from Morocco. And have you repatriated other times as well?
Yes, I when I got married, I moved to Kathmandu and we lived in Nepal. And after that, we lived in England. And so I did repatriate twice. The second time was much easier because I knew it was coming. That's the value of informing people about this. If they know it's coming, it doesn't mean it's going to go away, but it just means they're a little bit prepared. They'll still be thrown, but they'll understand the reason. So did I have I had kind of I came home from Morocco I was quite young, I think I was 23, right to my mother's house in Middlebury, Vermont. And suddenly I was speaking Arabic, I was speaking French, I was growing every day. And now, my mother didn't speak Arabic and wasn't impressed that I did. And it was like coming back it was like an extreme repatriation. It was right back to the life I'd led before, except I had graduated college. And it was probably more extreme than if I hadn't gone to my mother's house, where I spent not very long, actually. So yes, I think I would say it was a little bit traumatic, and we'd had no preparation from Peace Corps about repatriation. This was 1972. I think that has changed quite a bit now. This wasn't corporate repatriation. I wasn't repatriating with a spouse or children, and as you all know, that's a much bigger deal when a family repatriates.
Definitely. You're talking to someone who has repatriated 6 times. That's how often Linda has returned. And I've returned 3.5 times. Between us, we have 9.5 under our belt. People in where I'm living currently, it is like, they ask me what I'm working on, and I say, oh, I'm trying to finish this book on repatriation. And they're like, don't talk to me.
Nobody wants to talk about it.
Nobody wants to talk about it because also in an elder expat community, it means something very different in the stages of life that you're in. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. for obvious reasons. I mean, the more mature you are, in theory, the more stable you are. But the challenges you face at 30 are different from those you face at 50. And I guess you're talking about people even who've retired. Is that right, Doreen?
Yes, they've actually become expats in their retirement, in their 60s and 70s.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And so when you think about, have you considered repatriation? That's the last thing they want to talk about.
Yeah. They're overseas because they don't want to be in the US.
Yes, yes. So
What's the duration, I think.
yes, perhaps.
Yeah.
So I would like to ask you if you think there's an intersection between this process, which is for most people somewhat temporary, although I have met people who have suffered moments of it, they claim, for up to 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, do you think there's some measure of transitional fatigue involved in this process where you're just exhausted because you're having to process physical things, emotional things, maybe a new identity, maybe you're going, maybe different assumptions and expectations that you're not prepared for?
When you say transitional fatigue, you just mean being overwhelmed by all the various transitions that
Yes.
it involves.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Just like there's the other kind of fatigue when you adjust to another culture, an overwhelming number of new things to get used to. Yes, there are all kinds of new things to get used to when you come back. And again, I think what makes whatever the number is, I think what makes each of them more intense is that you're not expecting it. It doesn't mean when you expect you're going to have some difficulty adjusting to a foreign culture that it doesn't happen. But when you know what you're going to be up against, there's a certain readiness that just isn't there if it catches you off guard. And yes, I think there's a great deal of fatigue. It's in part, I think, what drives a lot of people within the first year, I would say, to really think seriously about going back overseas and trying to find some way. And also, even perhaps more serious, resisting adjusting because it's so challenging, it's so unpleasant and painful that why would I want to get used to this if there's an alternative? And I don't think that lasts much beyond the first year. Whether you do anything or not, you start to feel more comfortable just because you spent more time. But yes, I think fatigue is a huge factor, especially I would say the first 6 months and possibly longer. I think usually after a year, even people who might want to go overseas again, they can survive here, and it may not be their country of choice, but I can manage this. But I think before that, it can be too much.
Thank you.
Well, I was just thinking, with the years of experience you have with repatriation, have you noticed any major changes or trends popping up in the last several versus what you experienced yourself in the earlier years?
Yeah, I mentioned this in the book, the new edition. I think the biggest change, and I would say it's a change for the better, is that because of the internet and social media, people are no longer as isolated from home as they used to be. And if the more in touch you are with home when you're overseas, the more you understand about what it's like back there, and it's not a shock to you when you go back because you've been going back, if you will, every day with friends, and in the old days you had to send a letter, and that took a week, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think the biggest change is the accessibility of home to people who live overseas. And with that comes a lot of mitigation rather, of some of the challenges that everybody faces, because you haven't been so cut off. And so you're not so caught by surprise when you go back because you've been dipping into it, and even from where you live overseas. That was one of the biggest things. I think I mentioned in my introduction another big change that I saw. Well, technology is what I just mentioned. But I think that's the biggest one. That the possibility of being in touch with home has really multiplied, and hence the the consequences of not being in touch with home have been mitigated. It's still not the same, but I think, and that also, of course, applies to the professional world, the business world. Basically, you were out of sight, out of mind when you were overseas, except for one phone call, maybe a week from somebody back home. And now you're much more connected to the world you're going to be returning to. You know people. In the old days, you came back and everybody you worked with was somebody you'd never met before. That was a series of challenges. Now you've met these people, and it's just nowhere as near as foreign as it used to be. And
It's really interesting. I wonder if it can also give a sense of false security, though, because you think, like, I've been interacting, and then I do think people treat, in my own experience at least, people treat you differently when you're on a homely visit versus when you're moving back. And so I think you're thinking, I'm interacting all the time on Zoom and whatnot. People will just welcome me back and be excited that I'm there. And maybe that's not the case.
Well, I think it could lead to that, but that would only be the case with people who weren't expecting anything, and so. But yeah, I don't know if I call it a false sense of security. But I think you're right. You may think you're more prepared than you actually are, and you may think you're on other people's radar more than you actually are, because it certainly feels like that to you. But you can't know how fairly regular interaction with somebody back home. You still can't know how large you loom in their consciousness.
The technology is fascinating. I have a friend that actually purchased a home over FaceTime, which in the old days, we never would have been able to do that, right? But the agent walked around showing the house and they said, sure, put an offer in. It was a challenging market and that's what happened. So that made their repatriation a bit easier because they had a home to go to. But it seemed a bit risky to me.
Well, yeah. And I think all of what I just said, I think it would apply in spades to younger children who especially teens, teens, their identity is the group they belong to. And if they have a group that they belong to while they're still overseas, then when they come home, they don't have to create a new group. And I think, and they're aware of all the new trends in music and books and movies and television, and they're not out of it. And if you're out of it, of course, nobody wants you in your group, in their group. So I think probably the ability to be connected, maybe the biggest benefactors of that would be teens and maybe slightly preteens.
That's a really good point. Nowadays, a lot of that generation doesn't even want to have face-to-face interaction. So the child living overseas isn't necessarily going to be at a disadvantage because it's just how everyone back home is communicating.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, that's very true.
That'll be in the next version.
Okay, make a note.
Do you recommend any key strategies to people for making this successful transition? Or do you think our job as intercultural specialists is just to kind of be a microphone for people to wake up and understand that guess what's coming? This is a real thing.
Well, no, I think as interculturalists, our job is to make people aware of what's coming, and people like you be able to give them advice and tools. That's what I think of as the workshop at the end of the new edition. I don't think just listening, though that's a big deal. I don't think just listening is all we're qualified to do. I think we can educate people in general about the issues and actually be very specific. Here's what would help you if you did this. And of course, the trick is to do this ahead of time. By that, I don't mean the last month, but I think people really do need to start preparing in the last, if you're there for 2 or 3 years, in the last 6 months or so. As you pointed out, Doreen, in your recent list of questions, the smoother your farewell, the smoother your return, your arrival. The better you leave, the better you're going to enter. And you need to plan that. If you wait till the last week to have dinner parties with all the people you want to make sure you say goodbye to, they're on vacation, they're busy, and that doesn't happen. You really need to start that ahead of time. And but no, I think as interculturalists, we can educate and we can help.
Thank you. Let's talk about farewells. We're actually this episode is lodged inside the week where we're talking about farewells. Do you have best practices for farewells other than saying them earlier?
Well, no, I don't. As I wrote to you in your email, I had not thought about it very much, except to the extent that I did say do it sooner rather than later. And yeah, also, if people are informed soon enough that it's an issue, which is to say, if you don't do farewells, it becomes an issue for you, you really regret. So letting them know sooner so that they can plan it successfully. Other than that, I don't think it's important to think about it and to do it properly, and waiting to the last minute won't help. And then explaining why it's important to do it properly. I sort of just previewed that by saying that the more successfully you leave your assignment, the more effectively you come back home. And if you leave with things that were unsaid, with people you never got to say a proper goodbye to, that will simply make you regret even more. Well, it'll cause regrets to come up when you're already going through a pretty emotional experience.
Is there anything that anyone in your family has done, maybe instinctively, to make the farewell process easier that you can think of?
When I came back, as I did from Peace Corps, quite innocently, I hadn't thought about it at all. So I certainly didn't do anything on purpose to make my leaving more successful. I did, of course, contact friends and make last visits to Marrakesh and things like that. But personally, I didn't do anything to I didn't think about the farewell or, of course, I didn't think about coming home. My favorite movie is Lawrence of Arabia, so I was able to see it again soon after I came back from Morocco, and then I felt at home again.
What I heard is that you said goodbye to people and places by making your last trip. And I think that's really important. It's not just the people we're saying goodbye to, it's the places, the lifestyle, and so many other parts of our whole experience.
Yes, no, that is true. I didn't do it consciously, but I did it, and I'm glad I did.
I see so many people instinctively do this. A lot of people will write a letter to an old place. When I wrote Life in the Camel Lane, it was in effect sort of an ode to Saudi Arabia, as I sort of planned for another book in the future on life in the expat lane. You know, it's just going to be sort of a grateful thank yous for all the different experiences I had in each country. Because I think that the more we practice that kind of gratitude, then we begin to understand that it's almost like it's unconscious, it's subconscious within us, but it builds confidence and it builds grace. And I think that grace is really very handy when you're going home.
You're the Life in the Camel Lane lady.
I am.
Oh, now I know who you are.
Yeah, I didn't have white hair last time you saw me.
Well, I think, when I think about all the adjustments and all the difficulties, it's a truism, but you learn from difficult experiences. You should try not to make them any more difficult by staying purposely ignorant. But still, we do learn from difficult experiences. And I think the most important thing to tell people is that you will get over this. And just knowing that it just makes it all possible. To the extent that you can get over it faster, fine, but don't feel that you're not getting anything out of this, and that this is just suffering for its own sake, and there are no lessons to be learned here. There are a lot of lessons, and that's what makes it, I think, a very rich experience. But I think if people feel there's not an end to this, then it's really discouraging, and they tend to initially. And as something Linda just said, some people get the wrong idea from home leave, which is that, this is not, home leave is perfect. It's the best of both worlds. You're home, but you're not there. You're away from whatever you don't like about the other culture. But it's just not real, and it can be quite misleading. But if people know, to return to my other point, if people know there's the other end of this, and you'll come out at the other end and be stronger for it, then they can relax and get through it.
And
I
that can be
think
very
that's
empowering.
very empowering. Yes.
Yeah.
Linda and I are trying to presence this entire 30 days by saying that what if this really uncomfortable experience turns out to actually be some of the most creative soil for your life, for your new life? Because you can replant lots of seeds and lots of good ideas and lots of new activities. And you can decide to be, oh, I was that person. For instance, I went to an art workshop the other day and I met a lady who is working in egg tempura on iconography. And we were talking about, what have you ever done art before? She says, and I was kind of a wannabe artist for many years in Saudi just to use my time. But actually, I find now that going back to a little bit of art helps to kind of sew my life together. And the fact that I'm even considering doing some art again, it feels like a bridge between now and then. And the more bridges I can build inside myself by building on skills or talents or desires or activities is a good thing, right?
Yeah, I think to use your word, I think any intense experience, and this certainly is one of those, is almost automatically creative because one world ends and another world begins. That's not a very good way to phrase it, but the sense of possibilities is endless in terms of when you come back. You don't have to be who you were or what you were when you left. You're not who you were or what you were when you left. And if you'd like to go off in a new direction, what better time than now? So yes, I think when I just said that difficult experiences can be very rewarding. Maybe this is another way of saying it, that an intense experience like that, one of the rewards is creative. And certainly you look at everything differently. And why not yourself and your future? Why not look at that differently? People, what's frustrating for many people, as you know, is they think you're the same person, and you're not. And there's endless possibilities there to start, not maybe to start over, but to introduce other dimensions to your life.
Well, I did have one last question in that he talks about a lot of different groups within his book about their students and corporate expats and long-term volunteers and whatnot. Like, have you noticed any major similarities and or differences between the different groups that, in terms of how they handle repatriation or maybe the challenges that they faced throughout repatriation?
I think one of the themes, I think it's in the book, one of the things that differentiates different groups is the extent to which they really lived in the foreign culture. At the top of that list, the people who lived the least in the foreign culture would be the business community, basically. And at the bottom, probably something like Peace Corps volunteers, whose job is really to blend into culture. So I think one of the big differentiators, at least in terms of the intensity of repatriation and the elements, is the extent to which you've gone native, to use that phrase, because the more you've made that place home, then by definition, the less home is going to feel that way. And hence, you've got a lot more to readjust to in those cases. So I would say that would distinguish in a general way the issues. And I don't think students or maybe even Peace Corps volunteers, they don't have to deal with their skills not being recognized or used in their next iteration, though maybe Peace Corps volunteers would. So I think some of the issues that are for the business community wouldn't apply so much to some of the other groups, if that answers your question.
Yeah, very interesting. Something to think about.
Yeah,
everyone's experience is so unique, and then you start to even think about these bigger factors of what their living situation was in the host country. It's really interesting.
Yeah. I don't know if either of you ever were a Peace Corps volunteer, but when you learn another language and adjust to the other culture, you feel yourself growing every day.
Yes.
Something you couldn't do yesterday, you can do today. Something you didn't understand yesterday, you understand it today. And when you come back, you really miss that. You're just coasting, you're not growing. And sometimes you even feel you're regressing. So it's very hard for people who've adjusted significantly to the culture by learning the language and entering the culture. To replace that sense of growing is almost impossible when you come back home.
I would definitely agree with that, because that was my experience in coming back from Saudi Arabia. I had resisted. I had resisted for the first 5 years. It was really challenging, even though I had lived in the Middle East before and thought I knew Arabic, some Arabic. It was very challenging for the first 5 years. The next 5 years, we had 9/11 and a lot of terrorism. And so it was managing low-level PTSD for about 7 years. But the last 5 years, I had acclimated to it so much that felt in my heart, and in my whole being, that felt more like home than anything else. So I think that makes a huge difference. And now here, living in Mexico, well, some days I want to do my Spanish and other days I don't, Craig. So you're reminding me that I should be a better student of the culture that I'm actually living in. Thank you.
I don't want you to feel bad after this.
No, actually, my husband's at Spanish class right now, and I said, no, I have something to do. So I'm kind of avoiding it because it got to be a wee bit hard.
Yeah. Good.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Is there anything that you would like to share with our listeners before we wrap this up? And we will have all the information about the original, The Art of Coming Home, and the most recent book from 2022 with all of the updates and the fabulous workshop that's in there. Is there anything that you would like to say to our listeners who may be contemplating or in the middle of a repatriation?
Well, one thing I would like to say, it's not quite the answer to your question, is that anybody who hears about repatriation, it would be unfortunate if they left any kind of discussion of it thinking, oh, it really isn't a good idea to go overseas. In the first version of my book, I said, can you imagine the astronauts coming back from the moon, which is where the word re-entry came from? Can you imagine them, no matter how difficult re-entry is, can you imagine them wishing they hadn't gone to the moon? No. So any discussion of repatriation, the end point shouldn't be, you better think twice before you go overseas because you're going to have a hard time. We wouldn't want people to think that.
That's a great point.
That's a very good point. And I thank you for this. And all the love that you've laid down the tracks for us, like Linda and I, we just want to put these 30 episodes out so that people will have a resource. And we hope in future that we will, share it around as best we can. And we hope one day it might be a resource for you.
Well, thank you for doing what you're doing. I'm sure it'll help thousands of people.
We hope so. But it was a pleasure to meet you and to hear your stories. And I just ordered your book, so I look forward to reading it.
Oh, good. I can have another cup of coffee at Starbucks.
Yeah. Yes, please, on me.
I'm sorry I didn't have my books at my hand.
No worries. No bother at all.
No, this was really good. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Craig.